So is Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster an easy game? Simple answer, I have to say, is yes, but it all depends on if you're a newcomer or a Dead Rising veteran. It's worth noting that personally, it actually took me 4 days to actually get a platinum on Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. You know what, I'm actually just gonna call it DRDR from now on. It is worth noting as well that I did get the platinum for the OG Dead Rising, so for the most part, I did know exactly what I was doing. If anything, the only trouble that I kind of ran into, which we'll discuss later on in the video in the spoiler section, was just one section for my 7-day survivor. But a lot of the game is super easy. It's very kind of newcomer friendly. Obviously, it is worth noting that I actually did speak with some of my YouTuber friends, specifically a huge shout out to Zombfected and as well as Raccoon City Pizza, who were saying this was kind of like their first experience with Dead Rising 1 for DRDR. And they did say that it took them a little bit of time to kind of get used to the whole mechanics of timing and stuff. Obviously, for Zom, he's played Dead Rising games, but for Raccoon City Pizza, he's a brand new player to the Dead Rising genre. So it was very interesting to hear that for him, he was having some trouble at the beginning. So as mentioned, it really all depends on if you have history with the series. If you do have history, this is going to be a walk in the park for you for the majority of stuff. I think the only trouble that you might encounter is for the 7-day survivor challenge, especially if you go into day 3. The other thing that I also want to address in this spoiler-free section, as mentioned, we will go in more detail in the spoiler section of the review, but the thing that I actually want to go over is the whole controversy that kind of started with this game when it was well known that this game was going to censor a bunch of stuff. Now, it is worth noting that this is kind of a misunderstanding out there. There's not a bunch of stuff. If anything, I would say there's only like 3 things or something along those lines. It's not a big deal. At the end of the day, the game is still pretty much the same. There's just those, things that were obviously censored. And there is more that I also want to say in this section, because there is something that's very contradictory that Capcom did that didn't really make much sense. Now, the other thing that I also have to mention too is that I did get the game a day before release, so a huge shout out to Capcom Creators. But the one thing that I also want to say about that is that Capcom Creators doesn't really work like other companies. So I don't know if you guys were kind of staying in tune with the whole Dead Rising thing. For a month before the game came out, there was actually a bunch of creators that got the game early. Now, I can't speak on how how that whole process was, if Capcom gave them talking points, but I just want you guys to know that Capcom Creators doesn't work like that. They basically just give me the game and they basically ask us to stream it or make content about the game. So huge shout out to Capcom for not providing talking points, because there's some video game companies that are out there that do that, and it does affect YouTubers from actually giving their full opinion. And I just want you guys to know that that's not happening here. Like, Capcom Creators is a very different thing and they're very chill. And another point too is, if you guys saw my Shadow of Rose DLC review, you guys will know that I'm very honest in my reviews. I'm actually super blunt when it comes to stuff like this. So I would never accept a contract or anything of the sort where you basically have to censor what you have to say. That's not how I like to do things. I'm very blunt, as mentioned. So I will tell you the truth and how I basically feel about the game, right? So, and I should also mention as well, if you actually disagree with anything that I've said in this video, let me know down in the comments. I'm actually really curious to hear. But anyways, let's get back to the review. And the other thing that I also wanted to mention is obviously there's a bunch of quality of life updates that happen with DRDR. Like, for example, stuff like they made it so that the vent location in Dead Rising is super big, so everybody can just go. You have plenty of room to go around with the survivors. The survivors are obviously smarter. There's better graphics. You can also shoot while moving, which was obviously not implemented until Dead Rising 2. So they also added that survivors can now speak, so they don't all have the same one-liner that the OG had, which is super nice. And they also added item health bars. So as mentioned, this is not spoiler. These are all just like features that they basically announced with the trailers of the game. All of that was amazing. Honestly, I had a fantastic time, and I thought that those things were very needed for Dead Rising 1. If anything, it just improved on our, what was already an amazing game. But the other thing that I also have to mention as well that I thought was really great, and it was kind of shocking too, because it's not very normal. Like, for example, Capcom did decide to make this game sell at around 60 Canadian dollars, or I think it's 50 USD. And as mentioned, that's not normal for basically what we ended up getting as a remake, right? It's not like the standard Capcom remake, and I think that's why Capcom decided to call it a deluxe remaster. But if we see other examples like Dead Space remake basically sold at like the highest price point, right? Like the normal $90 or $80 USD. And then obviously we recently got Until Dawn, which is another remake, and that's also selling at the highest price point. as well as Last of Us Part 1. So this is very uncommon for a game company to essentially decide, yo, this is a one-to-one remake, so we're essentially just gonna give it not the full price range, but at a lower price range of 50 USD or 60 Canadian dollars, which, you know what, I do have to respect, because it would have been super easy for Capcom just to do what the whole other game companies are doing and just sold the game at $80. Another thing that I also need to mention that I didn't really like, as I stated at the beginning of the video, the game is very easy, especially if you're an OG Dead Rising fan. One thing that I think Capcom should definitely do to kind of fix this issue is they should add a harder difficulty for the story. Obviously, we have 7-Day Survivor, but the fact that 7-Day Survivor got really stripped down of its difficulty, especially with kind of, you know, the ability to kind of skip time. As mentioned in my previous video, if you guys watched that, I'm not a fan of game companies making their games super easy so that everybody can get a platinum. Personally, I think the game would do better if they just added an extra difficulty. Obviously, I'm not saying that the game should just change their trophies. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that's already too late for that. But I think just for OG veterans of the games, they should add like a harder story mode. But the last thing I actually want to mention in this section of the video is that if you're a Resident Evil fan and you're actually looking to play another zombie-esque game before Resident Evil 9 ultimately releases, or we end up getting another Resident Evil remake, then Dead Rising or DRDR is definitely something I would recommend. It's a funny story that honestly is a classic. I definitely think Dead Rising is a classic, and I think all Resident Evil fans should definitely give it a try, especially at the $50 range. Yeah, you're not losing anything. But anyways, now we're actually going to go over to the spoiler section, and for those sections, I am going to go and talk more in detail about certain aspects of the game. So for starters, let's actually go over things that I really loved about the game. But one thing that I thought was really cool was the fact that Frank could essentially upgrade his camera on the go. So you had access to aperture, you had access to, you know, the brightness of it, or, you know, the focus. All of that was super awesome. The only downside to that, in my opinion, is the fact that if once you get the camera parts and you replay the game, you do have to go around in the mall and get all of the parts again. So that makes it so you can kind of get a little lazy and you don't really want to do that anymore. But regardless, I still think it's a really great feature that I was not expecting. It was a huge surprise for me. Another feature that I have to talk about is the cops. The cops in the mall are a bit different from the OG, and apparently, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of was seeing on Twitter that this was actually an idea that they were trying to implement in the OG Dead Rising, but the fact that the cops are now able to shoot with their guns. If anything, it kind of reminds me of Resident Evil 6, where you had some of the zombies that would shoot their AKs or whatever. I will say it can get a bit annoying, kind of like skateboarding next to these cops, because these cops will just throw off your groove.
No! You threw off my groove!
I'm sorry, but you've thrown off the Emperor's groove.
And you'll just face plant or whatever. But honestly, I thought it was really cool addition to add. It kind of took me back for a second, because I was kind of like, whoa, what is this? Like, hey, like, I wasn't expecting to get shot in the game. So the first time when it happened, I assumed that the special forces was there, or maybe there was a survivor with a gun or a psychopath that was new, but it turned out to be a cop. Another feature too that I thought was very interesting, that's kind of similar too, because I first heard about it on Twitter, was the rocket launcher. I'm pretty sure I saw it in the Nemesis trailer, and I was like, whoa, what is this? Is this like a secret weapon, or is this like going to be like a bonus weapon that you get after beating the game? Because it kind of reminded me of like the same rocket launcher that can be found in RE2, which I think it is, but I don't really know too much about guns. And I will say too, it was kind of a surprise when I first got shot with the rocket launcher, because I had no idea what happened. I was literally walking through the mall, and then some special forces just shot me, but I had no idea it was the special forces guys. So at first I thought maybe it was like the parrots that had like the grenades in the Wii version of Dead Rising. I was kind of like, whoa, where did that explosion come from? But obviously then I realized that, oh, it's actually the special forces. Another small detail that I have to discuss, which is definitely a quality of life that I definitely want to see if they end up remaking the next Dead Rising games, or if we get a new Dead Rising game. But the fact that they also added like this button on PlayStation, it's R1, but if you're surrounded by a bunch of survivors and you're trying to like give one survivor something, like whether it's an item or food. I really like the addition where you could actually just press R1 to switch what you're looking at, like what are you targeting. And kind of along those lines as well, I really like the feature that once you give health to a survivor, they don't just automatically drop the weapon that they were carrying, because that was an issue with previous Dead Rising games. So again, it's a very minor detail, minor quality of life, but it honestly, it helps a ton, especially if you're like running around and you're you have to like be in a certain location at a certain time, which definitely happens a lot in Dead Rising. Speaking of new quality of life additions, there's one addition that I honestly kept forgetting that was there, and so I didn't really take advantage of it until after I beat the game like twice. But that's specifically, I'm talking about the blender that can be found in the security room. And kind of talking about the security room as well, I really like the new look of the security room, and there was also a lot of sections that they really kind of pimped up. And honestly, Paradise Plaza looked fantastic. I loved how all of the trees were there, the blue on top. It's honestly such a minor detail, but I loved how Capcom paid a lot of attention to that. I think there was like jellyfish or something, or there was like the dolphin statue, which was really cool to see. So I loved kind of like the paradise underwater kind of theme that they kind of went with. And the other thing too that I also forgot to mention about the security room was like the closet where you can actually go in and pick every single outfit in the game that you've basically unlocked if you went to go over there and got it, or if you did a specific challenge, aka trophy to get. This was a feature that was definitely in the previous Dead Rising games, more specifically Dead Rising 2, what comes to mind. The fact that you can go there and actually pick all of your DLC outfits. And kind of speaking about the outfits too, I think Capcom went far and beyond to give us so many amazing outfits from so many of their games. Obviously, since I'm a Resident Evil YouTuber, which obviously I'm kind of dipping my toes into other genres or other, I guess, survival horror games, I really, if you guys saw me stream Dead Rising, you know that I switched to every Resident Evil outfit, and stuff like that is just really cool to see. I also really loved using the Chuck outfit as well off stream. So yeah, there's so many outfits like that that I thought were just fantastic, and I definitely want to see that in the next, you know, if they end up remaking Dead Rising 2, or if they end up giving us a new Dead Rising game. Another thing too that I have to mention, and this was kind of a surprise for me, and at first I thought it wasn't in the game, but I really like the fact that you can actually drive your car, or aka your bike, everywhere's around the mall. Now this is something that the game doesn't explicitly tell you that you can do, but all you have to do is essentially just drive close to the doors and then just press circle with your bike. Now this doesn't work with every car. Also, like if you're taking a car from the parking lot and driving it to the door, it's not going to work. But what they did also add that I really loved was, and this was something that I actually mentioned 10 things that I think Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster should do, and that was the fact that you can actually take survivors in the car with you. Now I will say it's a little bit broken. Survivors don't get into every car also, because I did bring a survivor down into the underground parking and they wouldn't get into the truck. So it seems like it's a little bit inconsistent, which I think Capcom could definitely fix, and they should, because yeah, going around in the car with survivors was definitely something that I wanted, and it was great that you could do that. And it's also funny that you can also bring the bike all the way to like the vent location right before you go to the security room. But obviously you can't take the bike into the security room, but I'm sure there's probably going to be modders out there that will fix that. Another thing too that I have to mention is that the skateboards are huge. Like this is something that I noticed a lot of people were talking about on Twitter, but yeah, they're huge. And I also noticed that they're quite fast. I did obviously get used to the speed, but it's definitely an improvement from the OG Dead Rising. Obviously I played the OG and then I also switched to the Wii version, and the Wii version is a lot slower, but going from the OG to the Wii to the remake, it was kind of like a bit jarring, because I was like, whoa, this is so fast. And kind of another thing also that I forgot to mention was in regards to the outfits, I really love too that you could also switch all the music in the settings, or you could also do it in the locker when you're switching to different outfits. But I think that was a fantastic idea from Capcom. And I also have to mention too is the fact that the survivors, not only do they talk, as I mentioned earlier, they give you hints. So, you know, this could be like if you're going around, if you're walking around with a specific survivor, that survivor will sometimes give you hints as to like photo or PP stickers, prestige point stickers that you can actually take around the mall, or they'll tell you like, hey, the antique store has like this way, has battle axes, you should check that out, you know. So stuff like that was really nice, especially if you're a newcomer to the series. And on top of that too, I do have to mention that I really love the blood and gore of the game so much so, and this is, I actually first noticed this in when the director and the producer were kind of playing the game and kind of showcasing how it'll play, and they were like very, like one of the producers was super scared about like showing like all of the blood that happens when you're going around with a chainsaw. But honestly, Yeah, they did a fantastic job. The other thing that I also have to mention too that I really enjoyed was hearing the new voice actor for Isabella. This is something that I had an issue with in the OG, mostly due to the fact that every time Isabella's voice actor would say a Spanish word, like for example, even saying her brother's name in Spanish, it was said incorrectly. Like it was not done with a Spanish accent. Like for example, Carlito, she would say Carlito or whatever, or like Santa Cabeza, right? Or like they'll say stuff instead of Santa Cabeza.
I'll explain why all of this is your fault. There was no drug trade in Santa Cabeza.
Fine. I'll explain why all of this is your fault. There was no drug trade in Santa Cabeza. Just an American research facility.
So stuff like that, right? It's just very minor things, but I honestly really enjoyed how the new voice actor really added a great accent to Isabella. If anything, it just didn't kind of get me out of the game. It did keep me locked in and actually make it way more believable, as opposed to, as mentioned, the OG voice actor who did not even pronounce her brother's name correctly. Oh, and this is something I almost forgot to mention, but I honestly really loved the finale fight with Brock. This was crazy. I had no idea that they were actually going to do this, but they basically took the best part of the Wii version, which was the combat, right? The combat where you can actually do a bunch of the moves and you're kind of stuck on top of the tank. They basically added that into DRDR. Obviously in DRDR you can move around the tank, you can go back, you can jump down to where the zombies are. But the fact that after you've done enough damage to Brock and then being able to go up to him and basically doing a suplex or doing, you know, like all of the other moves was fantastic. And also the finale where you disembowel him was so funny. So I thought that was such a great addition to the game. Honestly, I would have also liked to have seen that with the convicts, because in the Wii, if you guys don't know, in the Wii version, there's actually a really funny moment where the guy in the back with the machine gun, you can actually go behind him and kind of choke him out, and you know the game actually tells you to finish him, kind of like Mortal Kombat. So I would have liked it if they had kept that too. But all in all, yeah, I was not expecting that finale fight to be way better. Honestly, I really enjoyed it. All right, so now we'll actually move on to the nitpick section. It is worth noting that by nitpicks, I just mean that they're very small issues that I had with the game. So for starters, the first thing that I have to mention is that when it comes to Brad's character, obviously it is worth noting that everybody in like the whole cast of Dead Rising, the OG Dead Rising, did not come back to reprise their role, which is very standard, I guess, if we're talking about remakes, or like, you know, especially when we compare that to the Resident Evil remakes. Everybody was essentially cast from the ground up, right? They got new actors for everyone. And one of the actors that I didn't connect really well with the character was definitely Brad. For some reason, I just did not care too much about the new actor's portrayal. He also sounded a lot older, in my opinion, as opposed to Brad's like OG voice. I think Brad is like in his 40s, is he not? I'm gonna have to double check that, but correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, so if anything, it was just something that I just did not connect well. I didn't connect well with the character of Brad and also Jesse. I suspect the reason that I didn't like Brad and Jesse in the remake is most likely due to the OG's performances really being stuck in my head. You know what I mean? Like I think I had a clear picture as to who Brad was, and hearing somebody else voice him was kind of jarring, right? I mean, I think a lot of people had issues with Frank's voice. Honestly, as I played the game, I did get better and I didn't have that issue, but I suspect a lot of people will have the same thing to say for Frank, right? Like obviously the OG Frank is so, you know, some of the OG characters that we probably already know are so stuck in our heads that having new voice actors kind of portray them is kind of jarring. Another thing that I was not a fan of was the Mega Buster. The Mega Buster I felt was super inconsistent, especially when it came to bosses. Sometimes it would kill bosses incredibly fast. Like for example, Carlito, I think, is a one shot, but every other boss, it takes like 3 shots or 4 shots. So obviously they did tone the Mega Buster down. And it's not only the Mega Buster too. We also have the chainsaw. This is actually something that I mentioned on stream, but it seems that the first swipe of the chainsaw feels like the OG, but the next consecutive hits of the chainsaw are really reduced in damage. So if you stay there and start using your chainsaw, it's no longer ideal. You won't take out a bunch of damage from bosses. You will too if you're attacking a survivor or like another zombie. That still works, but not for psychopaths. So that was kind of disappointing. As mentioned, I think they really nerfed the Mega Buster and the chainsaw. But funny enough, the sword, the lightsaber, the laser sword, I was going to say the lightsaber, but yeah, you guys know what I'm saying. I thought that one was a little more consistent, but obviously I think the only boss boss that I found it to be inconsistent with was Steven, the guy in the grocery store, and as well as Larry Chang, the butcher. I thought that they took a little bit more to kind of kill. I think I did like 2 swipes instead of 1. So there is that difference where the weapons are definitely more nerfed than the OG. Another nitpick that I have to mention too is that the final tank fight with Brock was honestly really easy. Like the health bar just went down so fast. Like I think I was already done with the tank, and like we didn't even do 1 loop. Obviously in the OG it took a lot longer, but they really sped that up. I would have liked it if they gave it a little more health, like we didn't do so much damage, because it just felt like I just zoomed by that tank boss fight. My next nitpick is something that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, but that has to do with the censorship. Obviously there was some censorship that was added in the game, specifically Cliff. When you're fighting Cliff, he doesn't say Kami. Larry Chang was super weird to see. I have to mention that Larry being more like, a lot of people were actually saying in my comments that they assumed that he was Asian, so half white and half Asian, and it kind of seemed like that. Honestly, I was kind of it was kind of taken aback when I first saw Larry in the new one. Seeing that cutscene was very strange, mostly due to the fact that it almost seemed like Larry didn't have an accent, but he was talking like he did.
You just wait right there, sir. In a moment, you can try the best ground meat you've ever tasted.
Whoa, ground? Wait a minute, listen.
Zombies are no good. I can't serve my customers spoiled meat like that.
Like, obviously, it's the same kind of dialogue as in the OG. That hasn't really changed, unless for, like, as we just discussed with, like, the Kami comment. But yeah, that was super weird. I thought Larry's whole change did not make any sense. And then the majority of the time, he actually spoke with, like, a perfect English accent, until, like, there's one section of it where he actually sounds a little Asian, like he's doing a little bit of an Asian accent. But the rest of it was really weird. Like, I thought that should have been, you know, like, what was the problem with Larry having a Chinese accent, right? Like, why did they heavily change that? I don't know. I don't really get that. And it just felt unnecessary because, as mentioned, it almost felt like they just stripped him down of his whole personality. Another thing too that I have to mention, if we're talking about censorships, one thing that was very contradictory that made absolutely no sense is the fact that they took out erotica. And the reason it made absolutely no sense and ended up being contradictory is that, yeah, they took out erotica, but then they still kept Cheryl's side mission. So if you guys are unaware, there's a side mission in the game where you go back to the security room is because Cheryl basically asks for you, and she basically wants you to take her picture, and she starts posing very, you know, very risque positions, so much so that, like, the survivors surrounding the security room are kind of like taken aback, and they're like, whoa, what's happening? That's the reactions. And obviously she starts saying a lot of, you know, seductive kind of like, yeah, I want you to have my picture inside of your camera, like just all of this like very erotica stuff. And so for me, it just was inconsistent. Like, if you're going to take the whole erotica pictures, PP, prestige points edition of the game, then why not take Cheryl's side mission as well? Why keep that? Like, that made absolutely no sense. And it almost felt like almost as if it was a last minute change, because it almost seemed as if you were supposed to get PP, aka prestige points from Cheryl's like side mission. Like, but to my knowledge, that's pretty much all of the censorship. There's only those like 3 things. I don't think there was anything else. And correct me if I'm wrong, guys, maybe I'm just forgetting maybe one more thing, but there's a lot of fans that were kind of saying that this was a demake. I was getting a lot of comments like that, and that's definitely not the case. It's just those sections. As mentioned, the erotica was heavily contradictory. It made no sense. But for the others, it's like, yeah, whatever. Like, there's such a minute part of the game. Having erotica taken away, it kind of sucks, but yeah, I get it. And I guess the last thing that I definitely want to mention that I thought was a huge nitpick, nighttime. Nighttime in OG Dead Rising, and also in the new Dead Rising games, like in the later ones is what I mean, is they basically made it so that the zombies felt more aggressive. So in the OG Dead Rising game, you would basically be walking, and if it was nighttime, all of the survivors, including Frank, would essentially get grabbed, like at all times. That was not really the case in DRDR, which I thought was kind of strange. Like, obviously the zombies still have the red eyes, they look more aggressive, but the problem is that they weren't. Like, they literally weren't. Like, they felt like they were doing the same thing as in daytime. Like, I don't know why they toned down the zombies. That could have been easily fixed. So I don't know if that was an oversight, but let me know if you guys also agree. Like, I don't know. For me, I noticed that when it was nighttime, it wasn't a threat. Well, compared to the OG, that was definitely a threat. So I think, as mentioned, I think it's an oversight. because it just did not make any sense. Anyway, so now we'll go on to my final thoughts and as well as my review score. So as mentioned earlier on in the video, I definitely think that if you're a Resident Evil fan and you've never played a Dead Rising game, this is definitely the one you should start out with. And if you like it, then you could always go back and play the OG. But, you know, for those fans that were kind of unsure as to whether they should get this, if it was going to be too censored, that's not the case, right? As mentioned, there's only like 3 things that were kind of censored, and one of the things made absolutely no sense. It wasn't consistent. It was contradictory. All in all, it's still a fantastic game. But as mentioned, I think Capcom should have made it harder. So that is going to deduct some points from my overall score. I'm kind of leaning towards giving it an 8.5, but it could have been an easy 9, a 10 from Capcom if they had honestly not made this into a deluxe remaster or just a 1-to-1 remake with like taking out like 3 things or changing things with the censorship and obviously all the additions. They could have just made it into a reimagining, very similar to what Resident Evil did. I think that that would actually have given the game closer to a 9 or a 10 in my opinion. Now, if you guys enjoyed my review, make sure to click this one where I actually reviewed Alone in the Dark remake. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.